Sure. Well, I know that he's quite cozy, really, to a lot of the big tech bros that have lined up in recent months with the current administration, and some of them I've been critical for a long time. Sort of the Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, more broadly the PayPal mafia network, obviously very associated with, the UFC network that's owned by Ari Emanuel, and some of those figures that I've been pretty critical of in the past. So I would assume, it's sort of related to that, because a lot of the people that he's tended to have on, at least lately, tend to be pretty much across the board very supportive of PayPal mafia involvement, intimate involvement in government, and I am not. So I would assume it's somewhere along those lines, but, I'm not necessarily involved in those decisions. And I don't know if I'd necessarily blame Rogan personally either, who's been actually rather complimentary of my work and has mentioned it several times on his show. But ultimately, very large podcasts like that have people that are involved with guest booking, for example, and may, make decisions that Rogan isn't necessary, or, turn down guests that Rogan might want to have on. I mean, who knows how those things really operate.
Right. I mean, the reality of it's probably not him making a lot of those decisions. He's probably very busy. And it's not that he's not the final line. I'm sure he is. But, you can only control what your staff brings to you. I mean, you can't control what your staff brings to you. And you can only say yes or no to what they present in front of you. And so if there's gatekeepers, I mean, that's kind of like the White House chief of staff, right? The gatekeepers there.
Yeah.
You're only presented with what you're presented with, and you get those options. And that's why it's really important to choose the right people who are around you to ensure that they're not going to gatekeep in a way that's
sure.
Also, when you're making hundreds of millions of dollars and you're parts of large platforms, you're going to have gatekeepers.
Well, I think even more than that too, I think it's been pretty clear with this administration and in last year's election that podcasts were really seen as a more important outlet for reaching the public than mainstream media, which I think is also pretty significant. So a lot of the biggest podcasts have definitely been arguably more influenced than others by that regard. And, a lot of these bigger podcasts, Rogan included, having Trump on, having J.D. Vance on. And I've been, of course, very critical of J.D. Vance's longtime benefactor, I guess you could say, Peter Thiel. He's also been on the Rogan podcast. I don't, I think he, some people there would prefer I didn't really maybe discuss some of those ties because they do come up in my Epstein related work. And some people, I guess in the case of, Ian perhaps has been pretty supportive of Musk and some of these figures in government, but also, does cite a lot of research for my book. So perhaps that was, a reasoning, but it's speculative. Again, I don't really know. And I'm happy for him that he had a chance to do, a big interview on, the biggest podcast in the world, I guess. But as you noted, I did have some criticisms, but as it related specifically to my book in my work, because I felt like some of the things that were conveyed weren't necessarily 100% accurate. And so because that's seen by so many people, and I'm not really doing that many interviews right now, and I'm not as active maybe as I used to be on social media and things like that, obviously people are going to develop conceptions and opinions about my work that are being given by someone other than me. And so I felt it was necessary to kind of, clarify a few things.
And the thing that you wanted to clarify was that you've never made the claim that Epstein was Mossad.
Well, that was one of the two, I guess, main things that I wanted to clarify. So, essentially my book does argue for a significant tie of between Epstein and the state of Israel. But really, the claims that are detailed in my book argue for a tie between Epstein and really Israeli military intelligence, more specifically as it relates to like a formal Israeli intelligence agency. And Mossad isn't necessarily part of Israeli military intelligence, but is obviously part of the broader Israeli national security apparatus. And so
what is the name of the Israeli military intelligence arm?
Well, so there's a military directorate that controls all of the Israeli military intelligence agencies. That's called Amman, and that was basically run by Ehud Barak, a close Epstein associate, in the mid 1980s, at the time that Epstein was alleged to have been recruited into that network via, Robert Maxwell. Some of the claims for this come from former Israeli military intelligence operatives like Ari Ben Menashe, but also some other sources that have remained anonymous but are deemed to be credible, and some other things, that happened over the years. And obviously there was some sort of tie there, as Epstein was awaiting, for example, his sweetheart deal sentencing, in the 2007-ish period. He was in Israel, presumably considering not returning to the U.S. to face, whatever sentence he was going to be doled out. It was during the sentencing period, I believe. But according to, local reports and, Palm Beach newspapers, he was touring Israeli military bases, which is kind of unusual if you're just a reclusive billionaire,
right.
Accused of
why do you think
sex crimes. You just
do you think it's true that Israel, bringing up the fact that he was thinking about not coming back? I mean, we've seen a lot of claims about Israel protecting pedophiles. I mean, do you think that there's some truth to that?
Yeah, I do. But I there's a figure that I've sort of been writing about who's not necessarily a pedophile, but he's accused of rape. The film director, Brett Ratner, who has some interesting ties to sort of the network behind Epstein and also to the Diddy cases. And a lot of organized crime ties that don't really seem to have been previously reported as it relates to Ratner. And Ratner was basically granted an Israeli passport a week after being Netanyahu's special guest at the UN alongside Alan Dershowitz. And he had previously, Ratner, done a major joint venture with this Australian billionaire named James Packer, who is one of the main figures in the Netanyahu corruption trial that's still ongoing for bribery and things like that. So there's a lot of strange things that sometimes happen in these power networks, and sometimes, and I'm aware of other cases as well that involve pedophiles specifically, where allegedly, they're granted the right to immigrate, and it's, all the circumstantial available evidence points to them evading charges in other countries and what have you. But that,
So as long as they're Jewish, though, just to be clear, they're not like bringing in a bunch of pedophiles. They're not like, any and all sex offenders. And
no, Israel's openly, at this point, an ethno state. So it's only for that specific demographic that benefits from those types of immigration policies there. Sure. Mm-hmm.
And it's our greatest ally. What's so insane to me is that people, especially on the right, Israel's getting plenty of criticism on the right, which is really nice to see, but it's also getting a lot of protection from people on the right. And a lot of them are these, Christians or Catholics, and they claim that they care about kids and their number one top priority is kids and the pedo circles that they want to crack down on. And yet they just seem to gloss over the fact that there's, that the Epstein operation clearly looked like a blackmail operation, and that they had no problem using underage kids in order to get that blackmail done. And the fact that Israel does seem to allow any sort of Jewish sexual offender or pedophile to run off and escape without being extradited back to wherever they committed the crime. It's how can people defend this? I just don't understand the defense. I understand Congress and them being bought off, right? I understand the big money interests. I don't understand the average commentator and why they're, unless they're also being paid too, which is very possible.
Well, I think these days a lot of influencers are being paid, and there are, scandals that have sort of mini scandals, I guess, that have sort of come out to that effect. But, as it relates, just the Epstein scandal alone, depending on what side of the political divide you fall on and how easily manipulated you are, or like what influencers or podcasters or whatever that you follow, there's efforts to link Epstein to certain names specifically. So in the right, a lot of people tend to look at Epstein as, Epstein and Bill Clinton, Epstein and Kevin Spacey, Epstein, and just specific names. And then, of course, on the left will be a more focus on Epstein and Donald Trump and figures that are more, hated by that particular political demographic right now. And there's consistently been an effort to sort of focus on the salacious material of Epstein, the celebrity aspect, his ties to famous people, or his ties to politicians of one particular divide, so that depending on who you're listening to, you can create an echo chamber, and people, on the right in particular, may not necessarily, connect Epstein's activities to,
a
Israel
operation for the state of Israel. Right.
Sure.
Like, rather than just it being, it was a bunch of rich people who are sick. I mean, that's, you make a good point. That's kind of what everybody's well, not everybody, but there's a lot of people that are kind of just reducing it to that.
Sure.
Like, this thing was way bigger than that. This is an assault on all of us, on every single American, is what that was. And Europe as well. They collected a lot of blackmail on Europeans also, not just the United States.
Well, I mean, it's a global thing. And it's been going on for a very long time. But I do want to go back to why I chose to clarify this in particular on Twitter, because as we've just talked about, I do absolutely think there was an Israeli state connection in some capacity, even if not Epstein being directly affiliated with, Mossad as an agency. But I do, basically what the thesis of my book is something much broader than that. I basically argue that Epstein was part of this transnational network that's also really transgenerational, that was created through basically this fusion of organized crime interests and intelligence agencies going back to the 1940s. And this, of course, would predate the existence of the State of Israel, which wasn't created until 1948. And these networks had already essentially come together by that point in time. And, I essentially argue that there's a significant amount of CIA ties, U.S. intelligence ties as well in this network, and that, they're transnational in scope. And a lot of the organized crime network that's affiliated with this spans, has a lot of interest in both the U.S. and Israel, but also, has expanded through partnerships, for example, between people like Robert Maxwell and Simeon Mogilevich to Eastern Europe, Russia, and beyond. And I think a lot of the stuff, for example, that sort of percolated up what was true about the stuff people were trying to go after Trump for in Russiagate was really more related to this specific organized crime network. But you can't go deep enough to prosecute anything without coming up with ties to powerful people in Israel and also the U.S., and it's ultimately, affects, at least as it relates to the U.S., both parties very significantly. Yeah. And I talked a lot about in my book about this particular network of oligarchs based in the U.S. That have been referred to by the Wall Street Journal as either the study group and the mega group, and how they seem to have a lot of influence over what Epstein was doing, and also, the governments of both countries, and pretty much most of the known members or earliest members of that group, including, Leslie Wexner and Charles and Edgar Bronfman, have historic, if not continuing ties to organized crime. So I basically make a much bigger case than saying Epstein was Mossad, for example. I think just saying Epstein was Israel is kind of reductive, because in trying to, if you really are interested in sort of informing people and with the intent of undoing this power structure's control over society, you have to understand that it's much bigger than any one nation state. And I think also, just like people trying to say Epstein was CIA, or for example, without mentioning Israel, it can be kind of myopic. You're absolving one of the other intelligence factions that was absolutely involved, and sort of taking people away from the fact that the power of these networks is transnational. It's not exclusive to a single nation state. And I think, those are ultimately important points. And what the evidence shows about Epstein is that he's tied to this particular network that knits together organized crime like oligarchs with intelligence agencies, and the influence that those networks have had, not just on Epstein's own network, but how Epstein, is basically middle management or a force for that broader network, and how he's making ties, for example, with every single major big tech CEO of importance. Obviously, Bill Gates got a lot of the focus, but, Mark Zuckerberg, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Sergey Brin, Larry Page, all of these people had some connection with Epstein.